Good afternoon. I'm Paroma Mukherjee from the Hindustan Times, and in conversation with me today is Steve McCurry, the acclaimed photographer and visual storyteller, most well known for his portrait of the Afghan girl that graced the cover of the National Geographic in 1985. Welcome to the Hindustan Times Leadership Summit, Steve. I hope you had a good session with Mr. Raghurai back in the day. I'd like to ask you about the Robert Capa Gold Medal that you were awarded in 1990 for the best photographic reporting from abroad. Now, not many people know about that you sneaked into Afghanistan, were part of the rebels, and then 10 years later you also photographed the Gulf War in 1991. Your recent work is a little different from that, and when did you actively move away from that kind of conflict photography to what you do now?
My work in the beginning was more about people, portraits, culture. It was only in 1979 when, just by sheer coincidence, I found myself in kind of the front line in Afghanistan. Some of these Afghans had told me about the war. I was interested. They invited me to come and witness what was happening, and I was captivated. I became obsessed with this story. I spent a month there, and I just wanted to continue to follow the story. And I went back like 30 times after that. But in my 40 years of photography, that's only maybe less than 5%. But it was so, I think the work was so powerful in what I've done that it kind of in some ways overpowers some of the other stories I've worked on, and the emotion was so strong that it's so compelling. The story's so this sort of life and death struggle. One side pitted against the other, and they're really, literally, it's a life and death situation. So it's kind of high drama, and it's just the stakes couldn't be higher. You had on the one hand this sort of communist socialist government, and then you have to understand the sort of more fundamentalist Islamic grassroots struggle, and in fact it's still kind of going on today.
Yeah, that's true. And I think I read somewhere that when you first came to India, you didn't leave for nearly 2 years, and over the years you mentioned during your session at the summit that you've come here nearly 80 times. That's incredible. I don't know anybody who lives outside India who's come back to India 80 times in their life. Most NRIs don't do that when they have their families back home. Did you ever think of photographing India's political landscape, given that it's such an integral part of the country, given that we're also the world's largest democracy and a very complicated one at that? Did that ever interest you visually?
Well, I'm more interested in stories that convey emotions, pictures that tell stories. Sometimes the political landscape is better dealt with in words, I think. The other thing is I'm at a huge disadvantage not being Indian. There's a problem with language. The other thing is I'm just not. I'm fascinated and love Indian culture, the land, the geography here, the different religions. It has, I think, more depth than any other country in the world. But the politics is something which has never really intrigued me so much. I mean, read about it and whatnot, but I think it's not so visual often. It's sort of like it's a story better told in words, I believe.
Given your vast experience of 40 years, you've also been a member of Magnum Photos, one of the world's most prestigious photo agencies. Photojournalism has been plagued by the ethics of representation over decades. It's as old as photography itself. and especially when you are an outsider and you visit places that maybe you're not a native of. Um, in your experience, have you struggled with that on the ground at all, or how have you navigated that? The politics of representation, the ethics of representation, considering you've traveled and photographed communities across the world, not just one country, and places outside of your own home. How have you sort of worked that out?
What fascinates me is what people do, how people live. My work in India, my photography is based on what interests me, what I find visually interesting. I'm not trying to tell the whole story of India. I'm trying to I photograph things that would interest me personally. Again, it's not a reportage where I want to show a little bit of industry and a little bit of sort of shopping malls. So I'm not. I think that there's other photographers that probably would do that better than I would.
News photographers, probably mainstream news photographers.
So this is my personal view. I've always tried to treat people with the utmost respect. I love to learn about places and people, and there's no better place in the world to learn and than a place like India, where you have the spectrum of culture, and you have the village life, and you have sort of high tech. You have people living in some of the most richest people in the world are right here in India, but then you have this extreme poverty. You have all these different religions swirling around. You're always engaged in India. There's always something to learn. So I don't feel that I don't expect somebody to look at my work and to really know the whole story of India. This is just one personal view, and in the same way, if an Indian photographer or foreign photographer came to New York or the U.S., I think that it's valuable for somebody to come and take a look at the place, my culture, and where I grew up, and look at it with their own sort of sensibility, their own viewpoint. You have this sort of foreigner coming here and looking at it. I think that it's fair game for all of us to look at each other, and again, I feel more of an artist or a poet, and I'm responding to this Indian experience in my own personal way. But don't look. I'm not. This isn't the story of India. This is my experience. What has fascinated me. There's festivals and regions that I've gravitated towards to the exclusion of others. But it's just my feeling is, life is short. You live once. I decided that the best use of my time is to travel, see the world, experience wonderful, unique cultures such as what we have in India. And for me, that's been my sort of main preoccupation for almost my entire life. I've traveled other places in the world, but I think the main part of my body of work is right here in India.
And you were commissioned to do the last role of Kodachrome. What was that like? I mean, I'm sure it was immense pressure to know you just have one single role to deliver, and I believe a fair bit on that role was shot in India as well. So can you talk a little bit about that experience?
Well, I shot Kodachrome for 25 years. It was probably the best film ever made, and when they discontinued it, I had a bit of a you know, kind of nostalgia. I kind of felt like this was an old friend who was departing, and I wanted to kind of pay this homage to Kodachrome. And because it was this vanishing film, I thought, why not, it's an iconic film, why not try and find iconic places or places which were near and dear to my heart. So I thought, New York, I live in New York, I photographed Robert De Niro, and then immediately I thought, well, India. I mean, that's really where I started my photographic career. So I had to go back to India and photograph a tribe, a group of people whose way of life is disappearing.
Right.
I also photographed Somali, Amitabh Bachchan,
Right.
kind of a sort of in the same vein as De Niro. So I spend most of the best part of the role is really with the Rabari people in Rajasthan and Gujarat,
right.
and then it's a little bit in New York. But it was such a shock to go back to film one last time,
Right.
because it was this very slow film, and I couldn't believe that I had spent so many years photographing that film, because it was so difficult to use.
Right, right. Well, thank you so much for
My
talking to
pleasure.
us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your trip here.
Thank you.
Thank you.